The will is like a distinct. Oh, I don't know. I thought she did. Vitality.
I think about it, right? No, I'm with you. We read the same text, but but on the imaginary, which is that sort of reading
I've cut down my tears over there are like, oh, like one or two hours. Yeah, that's right. That sounds interesting.
and I could see how you would like
Either under or quoted back to each other. That's fucking riding it. That's that tenure track. That's that tenure lifestyle. Wasn't there a professor like some math guy, maybe MIT or something like? I just remember hearing that he made some breakthrough discoveries, got tenure at like 22, and never published it.
why would you?
Really nice break from your like how different is the vibe when you go home and do a boss like roles or whatever fucking just learning hard skills. Cross register between like you gotta be you and tops and not quite sure. That's it. It's just because
You're like, yeah, we.
micro cheese. Literally on the I'm consistently want worst movie of all time. Tommy Wiseau is like single-handedly the worst movie ever made. There's a lot of like idiosyncrasies that make it not its worth. Like 100%. Crazy. I went to a live stream and one of the comedians and like giving a lecture before they asked a question. It was dead silence. The whole theater. I literally just said, I couldn't think of anything, put up my hand without a thought in my head, and waited for them to pick me, and then just like, first thing, are you into hats? Was the question. Oh, do you prefer 4 or 5 panel hats? Is that the hat? And it was just like dead silence. No one knew what was going on. And then he asked for a clarification. And I said, well, you know how some caps have 4 panels on them? Some have 5. It was really primo content. Actually, you can't have this. This is
So I thought I would begin today's class before we turn to Schopenhauer with some unsolicited advice about reading. So it is unwise in the advanced stages of your education to rely too much on school, on the university. So the university is good at some things and bad at other things. Not just Harvard, but universities in general. So it's good at technical exercises in specific areas of inquiry. How to solve problems in mathematical physics, how to read German, and so forth. What the university is generally bad at, surprisingly, is thinking. So the more advanced your education, the more important it is to take matters into your own hands and to organize your own education. If along the way of your schooling, you can find 2 or 3 people who inspire you, you should judge yourselves extraordinarily lucky. It often happens you can find no one. And then you have to seek inspiration from the dead. The most common defect in the education of educated people is an inadequate acquaintance with the history of philosophy. Because philosophy is the source of the fundamental ideas in our civilization. And this is a defect that can be easily remedied. And I wanted to suggest to you how. So, first, a study of the history of philosophy. In general, the professors look down on secondary works, on histories. They privilege primary sources. But this is a foolish prejudice. It's a form of intellectual snobbery. And there is one work in English which I especially recommend. It's Frederick Copplestone's History of Philosophy. It is just a history of Western philosophy in 12 volumes, written and published between 1946 and 1975. And it seems like a lot, but it's really not a lot. In a single summer, you can read these 12 paperback books that you can easily acquire on Amazon. And it has a great advantage over almost all the other histories of philosophy in English, which is its extraordinary self-restraint. So Copplestone was an aristocratic English Jesuit, a priest, but you wouldn't be able to tell anything about him from reading his history of philosophy, except his modesty. He disappears in the work. Most of the histories of philosophy are very opinionated, and they tell you what's good, what's bad. They make views that reveal the opinions of the author. Copplestone gives a straightforward account of the doctrines of the philosophers, combining detail with self-restraint. And I think that the best thing to do is to combine that method, the study of this history of philosophy, with intense engagement with one thinker, one philosopher. So choose a single philosopher. He won't necessarily be the thinker with whose ideas you sympathize. It might be the opposite. It might be the thinker whose ideas seem initially to you most antagonistic to your own. But having chosen one thinker, then read everything he ever wrote. Because that's a way then to enter into dialogue, engagement, with a single mind. And so those two methods give you a very fertile start to this task of mastering the history of philosophy. And after all, what is this all for? This is to achieve some measure of independence from the fashions, from the intellectual tendencies of your own place and time. So you get on a rocket and you escape the gravitational field. And this, after all, is one of the main aims of education. And so that's one of the reasons to study philosophy, and I think this is the best way to begin studying it. And control the amount of time that you devote to school, and understand, of course, that the further you go, the less important school should be compared to your self-education. That doesn't mean that you shouldn't use it, but you should use it, as I say, for the things that it's good at, which are these lesser things, and not for the things that matter most, which you have to provide to yourself. Now, Michael, would you like to say something about the study of the history of non-Western philosophy?
So First, in full agreement with Roberto, yes. So I began the study of non-Western philosophy, actually studied Western philosophy in exactly the way Roberto was mentioning it. It was not mentioned in schools, and even less so, even the words China or India literally never came up in the classroom. So I used to go to the local library and just start reading everything. And so as Roberto was done, let me say a few quick words about possible things to look at. So to begin with China, which is, of course is a tradition we'll be getting to in about 4 weeks, there really is not an equivalent of cobblestone in English. There is, however, a very good work that's a good starting place with one caveat that I'll get to momentarily. It's called A History of Chinese Philosophy, and it's by Feng Youlan. So it's F-E-N-G, new word, Y-U/L-A-N. It is a 2-volume history of Chinese philosophy, as the name correctly implies. Very, very good. The one caveat that you should be aware of when you read it, it was written a century ago, so this is at the height of the imperial period, and Feng Youlan very understandably saw his position as one of trying to convince the world that China had a philosophical tradition that was worth taking seriously, which at the time in the world was hardly an obvious proposition. And much of the work is written from this perspective, which means often he finds himself trying to say things like, note, when we get to give one example that will appear, a thinker called Mozi, note how similar this is to Greek logic. Note how similar some of these positions are to utilitarianism. In other words, moving from the example to the larger point, he's often trying to show that in Chinese philosophy, you have well-articulated versions of the main philosophical themes that will also be appearing in the West. An understandable move, but it means that he's always looking for those places, and I think accurately portraying them. It means he is less giving you what in some cases would be the more exciting side of things, which is where are the places where the tradition is going in a fundamentally different way that would really challenge a lot of the directions that are occurring in the Western tradition. That being said, it's still worth reading because by reading it, you will get a sense of the main directions, who the main figures are, the main shifts. When you think about things like, we'll discuss it literally probably in 5 minutes in 4 weeks, the Neo-Confucian rereading of the tradition, if you're reading Feng Youlan, those 5 minutes, you'll see that that is a fundamental shift in the entire tradition, every bit as crucial as the Renaissance is in the development of Western thought. So taking out the time to read those 2 volumes would be very, very well worth the effort. Then you certainly will need to follow up by reading the primary sources because, again, you won't always be agreeing with Feng Youlan's approach. However, it is a great starting point. I don't think, although I look at the people who are studying it, I don't think there's an equivalent for Indian philosophy. If anyone has a recommendation for the Indian tradition, do you have a recommendation? I don't think there really is a great equivalent yet on the history of Indian philosophy. So for that, we will still need to wait.
And the third would be the
Yes.
history of Arabic or Islamic philosophy.
Yes.
And again, there are a number of works, but I don't know that any of them is a standout.
Exactly. So for all of these, what you'll probably end up having to do is just read a lot of things as opposed to one single work like Cobblestone. Yeah, please jump in, please.
There's one good attempt via podcast that I know.
Oh.
The History of Indian Philosophy is like a very solid attempt, co-written by Janardhan Canary, presented by, can't remember, but yeah, pretty good.
Wonderful. And Ganeri is an outstanding scholar, so good. Thank you. I haven't listened to that. So yes, thank you so much.
Any comments or questions about these preliminary remarks?
Yes, please.
Yes.
Oh, it doesn't matter anywhere.
So, whenever I've learned something in life that felt worthy of my life energy, it's virtually always been important to apprentice myself to, let's say, a living embodiment of the practice. So in this case, I appreciate that you mentioned like books we can read and to kind of enter into the mind of a single philosopher as much as possible. Could you say anything about the role of being in relationship with a living philosopher
Well, it's great if you can
Yeah.
find it, but I think it's, as I say, it's luck. It's circumstance, and you shouldn't have to depend on that.
Okay. So it's not a deal breaker if it doesn't come along for us?
Sure. No, it's not. I mean, it's you can't count on that. But chance favors the prepared mind. So if you're oriented, you're paying attention, who knows what you can find, huh? You're more likely to be lucky. Yes.
Do you think that there's a limit to analyticity and thought, and that sometimes you need to move away from that and into more embodied flow activities that get us, yeah.
Well, of course. And this is a subject which naturally arises in the discussion of Schopenhauer today, and I hope we'll come to it. So I was dealing just with the intellectual component. So inspiration, I think the fundamental issue that is existential is hope. We're going to speak to that in Schopenhauer and where it comes from, because it is a common prejudice that hope is the cause of action, but for the most part, hope is the consequence of action. And not just practical action, but imaginative action. By acting, you discover contradiction, possibility, transformation, and then you become hopeful. So hope is not just something that happens to you, it's something that you can make happen. And I think that is something which cannot, of course, be replaced by the reading of books. Michael.
I fully agree. Should we jump into
Schopenhauer.
Schopenhauer? Perfect segue to Schopenhauer. So, let us now turn to Schopenhauer. And to introduce this, let me explain why we are assigning him when we are and what our larger goals are. So we have already begun the discussion, and we'll continue this next week as well, about the development of Christianity, the ways that Christianity developed in its most powerful forms, the ways it had become and has actively become domesticated in, at least in our opinions, less powerful ways, and then the ways that we can look at different attempts to bring out the more powerful elements and ask what would it mean to live up to those most powerful elements today. So we were looking in our very first class about how one secular version of Christianity took the form of, for example, political liberalism, etc. We will be looking next week at Nietzsche and Emerson, two very different ways, to say the least, of giving a naturalistic rereading of Christianity, and that form taking a sense of a radical self-fashioning of the divinized individual. And we've already begun to get a sense, and we'll certainly be discussing in much more detail down the road, Roberto's rereading of the tradition and attempts to rethink it for the future. Today, we will be looking at one piece of the same set of issues with Buddhism and the Upanishadic traditions. So, Schopenhauer is, of course, a 19th century European thinker, very strongly influenced by Buddhism and the Upanishads, naturalizing both, so taking a core piece of the metaphysics, but as we will see, taking out another key element of the workings of both Buddhism and the Upanishads, and trying to give a modern rereading of that tradition. And as in these other examples, we will be asking, what are the implications of doing so? Has he built on the most powerful elements of the tradition? Where has he done so? Where has he perhaps failed to do so? And what can we learn from that exercise as we are attempting to do the same? Now, to set this up, let me move first actually to things happening right before Schopenhauer in the 19th century of Europe. In other words, earlier attempts to secularize and naturalize Christianity, because these will be the key things that Schopenhauer sees himself as reacting against. So, we mentioned in our very second class Kant, but only one little sliver of Kant. So the little sliver of Kant was the whole notion of the individual as an autonomous agent only living by actions that could be made into universalizable laws. Let me say a few more words about Kant, because the much more important, significant part of Kant's thinking that would fundamentally shift all of Western philosophy is part of what Schopenhauer is both building on and reacting against. So, the very quick version of Kant that will be crucial for a lot of the terminology that might have seemed very mysterious when you were reading Schopenhauer is the following. So, there is a world out there, probably, that we can call the thing in itself. I say probably because the thing in itself, by definition, is something we as humans can never and will never know. It is what he will call the noumenon, the thing in itself. It, the noumenon, provides the stuff of our experience. However, what we experience is not the noumenon, and all of previous Western philosophy that was concerned with epistemological questions of how we clarify our representations of the world to get it closer to the thing in itself, for Kant is, or was, a total and utter absurdity. On the contrary, everything we experience is what we humans impose upon that sensory incoming into us. We, as humans, give that stuff that we experience the shape of causality, rational space and time, an ordered world. These are things humans give to the world. And if we do so properly, we will do so, and this part will remind you of the little sliver of him that we did discuss, universally. There are proper ways of understanding space, time, causality. These are universal, but they're not universal because they exist in the world in itself. I mean, they may or may not, but we have no idea. That's irrelevant. They exist because the human mind gives the world the structure that we operate within. Insofar as this is the case, this is why, going back to the piece of him that we did introduce, all of us must become rational agents operating properly within the world of rational categories that we can all universally agree upon, not because we consensually agree, but because they are correct, because this is the way the human mind properly organizes the world, and everything would follow from that. We become, and Kant would be very hesitant to use the terminology I'm about to give, but I'll give it for reasons that will become clear in a couple of sentences. We become like mini gods who are giving form to the world. Now, Kant would never, ever use terminology like that, but I give it because the next major thinker will go there in spades. Hegel will come soon after Kant, and Hegel will say Kant was way, way, way too limited in all sorts of ways. We touched on Hegel very briefly 2 weeks ago, but to give a slightly more meat to it, because this is what Schopenhauer will strongly be reacting against, Hegel wants to say, yes, one little piece of everything we have described from Kant is correct, he would want to say, but that was one moment of understanding in the larger teleological development of consciousness. And once one works out the entire history of consciousness, what one realizes is the following. Originally, consciousness, which is embedded in humans, but as we will see momentarily, is not limited to it, consciousness was so involved in the world that it had no distance from it and no understanding of it. And he will locate this historically in what he will see as the pre-Greek philosophical and religious traditions of the world. Then, for Hegel, with Greece, for the first time, he will claim, you get a break in forms like, as we've noted, the Platonic ideas that form a break from the mundane world of our experience. That break marks consciousness breaking from the world and therefore beginning the possibility of understanding it. But insofar as it does so, it begins the process of consciousness being alienated from the world. The remainder of Western, exclusively for him this is Western, once you get the Greek breakthrough, of Western philosophy consists of the progressive development of a rational understanding of the world, but again, with that progressive distantiation, which reaches its ultimate point, indeed, in Kant. The next stage is, of course, Hegel. And at this next stage, what you are reaching is absolute I should put it too mildly, self-consciousness of the absolute spirit, which Hegel thought he was part and parcel of. And what this would mean is, once this occurs, consciousness has now reached a stage where it is now fully re-embraced with the object. There is now a perfect linking of consciousness with the world, but in that perfect linking, it is an accurate understanding because you had the distantiation, so it's not like that linking in the origin, so you still have science, rational understanding, but you also have consciousness happily no longer alienated from the world, now fully embedded in the object, fully embracing the object, which would mean, as we discussed 2 weeks ago, politically and ethically, now we are able, once we achieve this fully, to comfortably live in the world because we have achieved the final end of history, which for him is an end of the entire history of the teleological development of human consciousness. That final endpoint is fully rational, fully accurate, and involves with consciousness fully embedded and properly so in the rational workings of the world. Schopenhauer comes right after. And Schopenhauer hates Hegel. Among the many critiques he will say is the following. Yes, he will want to say in response to Kant, and even that moment in the development that Hegel will agree to, yes, the world of our experience is in fact an act of the will. So we humans, as Kant would say, and Hegel would simply say this is only one moment in the development of consciousness, rationally impose order upon the world, and that is an act of the will. However, Schopenhauer will say, and here you are immediately beginning to see the places where he will build explicitly upon both Buddhism and the Upanishadic tradition, he will say the will is fundamentally based in our base, most horrible desires, and therefore there is nothing rational about it. Nothing. The degree to which we think it is rational, or the degree to which Kant, for example, thought it was rational, is the degree to which he was horribly deluding himself by thinking the human will was natural. The human will is a product of our desires, and we, with our desires, create these illusory worlds through acts of will. The result is a horrible world of our creation. However, he wants to go further in his critique, and this will get him into his strong critique of Hegel. Thus far, you're getting a sense of a Kantian vision where our act of the will, imposing order upon the world, is in fact a will that's fundamentally embedded in our desires. He then goes the next step and says, but like Hegel, our consciousness is a part of the world and represents a working out, a teleological working out, to some extent, we'll see, of that world. But insofar as our consciousness is a part of the world, it means the world itself is also will in this specific sense. It is embedded in desires and it is not rational. Hence, the world is both will and representation, and hence, of course, the title of the book, meaning that we represent the world as will, as an act of will, in all the ways that Buddhism critiques it correctly in Schopenhauer's view, and moreover, metaphysically, that is what the world is. The world is will, but again, will fundamentally embedded in acts of desire. Meaning that the world is fundamentally irrational, amoral, and all of our human strivings through acts of will to organize the world properly by rational principles, insofar as they are fundamentally embedded simply with our desires, are doomed, and doomed to create suffering. Suffering, though, note, and I'm sure you probably noticed this when you read it, he's not so much talking, and there are a few places you could read it maybe as saying this, but not much. He's not really meaning suffering that we are creating to others. He means personal suffering. When we strive in the ways I just mentioned to impose order on the world and impose our will upon the world, we create suffering for ourselves, foolishly thinking we will achieve happiness and dooming ourselves to a life of endless suffering. And hence, on the contrary, we need to realize if all of our strivings and efforts lead to nothing but suffering for ourselves, what we need to do is withdraw, end our sufferings, live an ascetic life, a life without striving, and seek those things that allow us to connect deeply with everything else in the world, minus this striving. And he thought there were some things possible that allowed this to occur, music being his favorite and most significant example. So with music, we have the experience of that larger world. It is a world of will and representation, as we've just discussed, but minus our failed striving against it to impose our will upon it. It is therefore ultimately a philosophy, a self-proclaimed philosophy of pessimism. It is a philosophy of ultimate world rejection and an explicit philosophy of rejecting human striving, saying, on the contrary, accept that the world is irrational, we cannot impose order upon it, and we must therefore reject our attempts to do so. Please.
What is the rationality that he's rejecting? Because I feel like you can have a first principle, and that might not be rational, that might be from intuition.
Yes.
But once you have a first principle, you can produce things rationally.
Yes.
You wouldn't be denying that, would you?
I think he even wants to deny that, because I think what he would want to say is even that work of working from a first principle, if not even the positing of the first principle, but even the work thereafter, would be our attempts to act rationally, failing to see the degree to which our rational attempts are embedded in our desires. So he wants to go the next step and say, even the things that a Kant and a Hegel would see as rational are fundamentally not. They're deluding themselves. This is a radical thinker. Yeah, please follow up. Yeah, please.
Just even to the point of like the modus ponens argument form, if x then y, x therefore y, he'd reject that as a product of our will.
Yes, he would, yes. and the reason I put that in strong terms is for him, it absolutely is an act of the will. The world itself is an act of will, and all acts of the will are fundamentally parts of our desire. So yes. Now, surely we live in a world of causality, so if I want to get water, I'll drink water, because causally my drinking water will give water within me. So he won't rule out all action within the world, but he will say all action within the world is ultimately doomed. I may get my water, but I'm still going to be thirsty and die and miserable and sick. So ultimately our strivings are doomed. Yes. Which doesn't mean they don't work, it just means they're doomed because they're based upon desires. Yes. Now, let's think through the implications of this position. It is a position of radical pessimism, radical rejection of the human will, radical rejections of the possibilities of human striving to make the world better, and he sees himself explicitly as coming out of Buddhism and the Upanishadic traditions. Now, let's talk a bit about that move. So when he claims to be coming out of Buddhism and the Upanishads, note immediately what he has done. So he is again giving a naturalized, secularized reading of both traditions, which means he is going to choose, out of acts of the will, I'll even put it that way, by his own terminology, to ignore parts of that tradition and build upon others. And let's talk about those decisions of what he is building upon and what he is leaving out. So as we noted, we discussed the Upanishads only briefly, but certainly as we noted in Buddhism, part of the power of the Buddhist tradition is this tension that we noted, where on the one hand, yes, it is absolutely making the argument that Schopenhauer correctly sees and builds out to say, we humans have constructed a world that we mistakenly think to be the world. In fact, we have constructed a world out of acts of will. Those acts of will are fundamentally part of our base, most grotesque desires for permanence and attachment and self-control and domination of the world. Insofar as that is the case, we have constructed a world of intense suffering that we don't even see because we just think this is the world. And hence we live a world where we are creating intense suffering that we do not see. And in fact, we endlessly build worlds to insulate ourselves from that fact. We are all, as I noted last week, Siddhartha in his palace, trying to create these nice little worlds where we are perfectly happy, not seeing the degree to which, by our very acts of doing so, we are creating intense suffering around us. And therefore, indeed, we must reject our attempts to do so. We reject our attempts to do so by rejecting the will, rejecting the self that has been created by that will, and rejecting the worlds we have created precisely through those acts of the will based upon this vision of the self, all of which Schopenhauer is building upon. Note what he's not building upon, which is equally powerful and equally telling. Would this therefore lead in Buddhism to simply saying, let's reject the world and run away? But as we noted, in Buddhism, no, because then you have the other side of the tension, which is it will up the ante on how difficult that next stage would be. And we noted some of the ways it does so. Karma. In the workings of karma, every single action we are taking is going to have consequences insofar as we are living a life that is not enlightened. In other words, a life based in our acts of the will that are in turn based upon our base desires, constructing worlds for our benefit. We are creating intense suffering. That intense suffering will not only continue for those we impact while they are alive and while we are alive, it in fact will create consequences that will go on lifetime after lifetime after lifetime for eons. So dramatically upping the ante on how much suffering we are creating the sense that literally you are trying to be self-conscious all the time of the degree to which we are creating suffering and the degree to which we need to be acting to break this. Note also, even to achieve enlightenment, as we've seen, to achieve that, you would have to undertake intense levels of discipline, beginning at the level I mentioned, becoming ever more self-conscious and aware through disciplined work of the kinds of suffering we're creating on a literally moment-by-moment basis in our lives. But even if you do that, that's the first step. You will then spend lifetime after lifetime after lifetime for eons, hopefully reaching the point where you could even begin to become so enlightened that you could truly be acting in a selfless way, not imposing suffering, but actually, amazingly, on the contrary, ending suffering and acting compassionately around you. And even after all of those eons, were you so foolish as to think, okay, I've achieved it, now I'll jump into nirvana? That, of course, would be selfish, because that means you're not trying to compassionately help all of the suffering of all the living creatures in the world. And if you're selfish, you're not achieving nirvana, and you've lost it. So it radically ups the ante on how difficult this is to cut out any easy way out. And note too the implications, as we saw last week. So what does this mean in social practice? What it will mean in social practice is work in the world at levels that are difficult for us to even imagine. The examples I gave. So you have Gandhi, who's coming out of both the Buddhist and the Upanishadic traditions, sort of again a rereading of both, but in a very powerful way. And for him, you do the training to stand in front of people who are literally beating you, causing brain damage and death, not doing anything. Simply to make the argument, in that case to the British Empire, this is your empire. Don't tell yourself you're liberating the world by civilizing the savages. What you are doing is this. So in London, you have to open the paper and see, this is what we are doing. When you get to give the other extreme example I mentioned last week, self-immolation is critique. You sit there and you set yourself on fire. You can't even cry out in pain as a protest. Again, a level of discipline impossible for us to even imagine, but you do it precisely for that reason. You are able to say, if you can achieve this, I will make an ultimate protest, but again, it wouldn't be ultimate because you're coming back in a future life, but an incredible protest against current power structures as an act to end suffering. Purely compassionate, by definition, as selfless as you can imagine, beyond actually what we can imagine, but in these examples, you see the power of the tradition. Now, I'm sure where I'm going with this is clear, but now let me lay it out. Note the implications of Schopenhauer when he builds on one side of the tradition, completely accurately, all of the critique about will, the degree to which we construct worlds out of our will that are in fact nothing but our base desires, and how we must reject the will and reject the self created by the will and reject the illusory world we have constructed through that will. He builds upon that, but once he takes out everything else, once he takes out karma, once he takes out the entire vision of radical, compassionate involvement in the world, but selfless involvement in the world, once he takes all of that out, what you're left with is, well, what you have read in his ethics, which is, and I'm not completely exaggerating here, this is literally the case. We have lots of discussions of him by contemporaries, sitting in his room, listening to music while servants feed him food. And ironically, from a Buddhist perspective, that is Siddhartha in the palace. That's precisely what you don't do. That is simply me trying to soothe myself by ending my striving and listening to great music and getting fed by my servants, which is not ending striving in a powerful way to compassionately help end suffering in the world. Why isn't this simply my personal happiness that he'll claim isn't happiness because I'm rejecting the will and I'm ascetic and blah, 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 but sure, he's still being fed by his servants while listening to amazing music. And so I say this to raise a question for all of us, and I don't mean to imply I have an easy answer to it, but I think that's part of the power, is there aren't going to be easy answers to a question like this. If we think there's something powerful in the Buddhist tradition, I mean, agree with it or not, that's a separate question, but something powerful that we want to wrestle with in terms of how it would challenge our assumptions, note how Schopenhauer has attempted to naturalize it and secularize it in ways that are potentially very limiting and ironically even falling into the very, very kind of, I don't want to say self-absorption, that's unclear, but a kind of, just calming myself down that a Buddhist tradition would strongly push against. If that is one mode of secularizing and naturalizing the tradition, it perhaps has, I would at least say, huge dangers. And then the question would be, if that is the case, are there other ways to do it? How could we naturalize or secularize these traditions? If we are not believers, say, in the workings of karma, maybe we are, but if we are not, how would we do it in a way that would give you the power of the tradition, in a way that I fear, I hope I'm not being unfair to him, but I don't think I am fully, in a way that I think Schopenhauer really has kind of lost by giving up all of that and not doing something to build that tension back in. And so I fear with Schopenhauer you have a brilliant thinker, but a brilliant thinker who, by building on one piece of the tradition, has ironically given himself an easy way out. He would not call it easy, but sitting in your room being fed by servants listening to music, it kind of sounds like I'm calming myself down, I will no longer personally suffer, and he's taken out, by definition, any concern with the suffering of the world, which he doesn't now have to concern himself with because he's being fed by his servants and listening to music. So, if that is one way to secularize and naturalize one of these powerful axial age movements, are there other ways? And as we've been posing with Christianity, what would that mean? And I'd like to pose the same question with Buddhism. What would it mean with Buddhism to secularize and naturalize it in more powerful ways than perhaps Schopenhauer has done? So let me. Should we take immediate questions or?
No,
yeah, let's first open up for questions, and then we'll turn to Roberto. Yes, please.
Just that Jay Garfield is a good example.
Yes.
Of naturalized.
I agree.
Naturalized Buddhism.
Yes.
And you can give an account of karma and not really rebirth, but karma you can say to be within this life karma.
Yes.
It's related to just causal determinism.
Yes.
So I think you can save a lot of Buddhism and have some really good stuff in a Western naturalistic lens.
Yes, and let me just underline that. I agree completely. So, and the figure in question here is Jay Garfield, who has very much made this argument. And just to underline it, yes. So the Buddhist tradition will push this notion of eons and eons and eons to, again, just so push up the ante that would push against any easy way out. But I think you're exactly right. You can work this out even within the span of our lifetimes. And even within the span of our lifetimes, if we really are forcing ourselves to recognize the degree to which we are actively creating suffering by the ways we build worlds, the degrees to which we don't see that suffering because of the degrees to which our worlds are Siddhartha in the palace. They're attempts to not have to see what we are really doing. And if you take that seriously, can you still get all of the power of the tradition without, by definition, therefore, giving you the easy way out of, oh, I'll just sit in my room? Because if you're taking it seriously, then no, you have to change the world that you have constructed. But again, you have to do it without an active notion of imposing the will on the world. So I agree fully. To me, that would be the much more powerful way to build out a sort of naturalistic rereading of the Buddhist tradition. Yes, thank you. Yes, please.
Yeah, so you give an example from his personal life, but I'm just
Yes.
wondering if this is actually what he believes that we should do. So
Right.
lots of people are
Great question. Yes.
say something and they do something else.
Right, yes.
And if I remember correctly, when he discusses suicide, he's like,
Right.
that doesn't really help. because
Exactly.
Then you have all these other people
Precisely.
still struggling with the will.
Precisely.
So is he saying something more?
Yeah, no, and
That's
and yes, I think you are right. I think he is saying something more, and he'll write this book in part for that reason. So he will write this book out of an attempt to wake us up, which means, as you said, he wants to make a change in the world. That being said, what would concern me is what he seems to be saying in the book is, do what I'm doing, right? I mean, not when he's writing this book, but do what I'm doing in the sense of cease your striving. You're simply dooming yourself to unhappiness. We need to stop all of this. So I think you're right. It's not simply, literally, he's sitting in this room doing nothing. But I think he sees his main intervention as writing this book, the more message of which is cease your striving. Yeah, so I fear there's still something to the critique. Yes. Yeah, it's still not the kind of, therefore, what do we do to alter this world? But again, alter the world not as an act of the will, which is the way we would tend to think, of course, that's how we would change the world for the better. Yeah, thank you so much. Yes, please.
So my question is about the idea of desirelessness. 'Cause
Yes.
It seems that the idea of when Schopenhauer abandons his desires and he kind of just starts listening to music, it seems that one, abandoning your desires, desire is kind of the way people create music and create a lot of the positive opposites of this kind of nebulous state of just sitting in your room. So who's making the music in Schopenhauer's essentially world of kind of sedating people? It seems to really de-individuate people.
Yes, and that's a perfect way of putting it. Wonderful question, and again, your terminology at the very end is like, I think, captures the heart of it. So you're absolutely right. He sees salvation and redemption in art. And you're absolutely right. I mean, isn't art a product, by his own definition, of the product of the will? Because by definition, it has to be in his own philosophy. So why would a product of the will be somehow our redemption if, by his own definition, that's a product of the will? And I think the answer he would give, and I'm sure it's clear from my tone of voice, I'm not completely convinced by it, but I think what he would say is, yes, it's an act of the will, but because unlike other acts of the will, which are actually attempts to politically alter the landscape, which are immediately doomed to destruction and our own suffering, he wants to say, at least with art, it's an act of the will that actually reaches beyond that striving and allows us as the listener to therefore get a conception of a larger world outside of our will. So if that would be his answer, and I think that is his answer, when you read his works on this, it only underlines the power of your question, which is to say, well, if we can do it there, doesn't that mean we're capable of doing it? Doesn't it mean we're capable of doing it when we create art? Because he's saying, by definition, yes. And couldn't we then continue whatever it is we're doing in art more broadly? And if we're also doing it when we're listening to music, could we not learn to listen more broadly in the world? And again, therefore, act in the way that we are doing when we make art? And why in the world cut out those acts of the will, even if the argument is all acts of the will are desires, but if by definition he is committed to saying some of these acts of the will born of desires lead to something incredibly powerful, then doesn't that open the floodgates for other possibilities? And I agree with you fully. It's intriguing. He doesn't want to go there, and yet him listening to his music seems to imply he should be going there. Yes. Or at least more importantly, we reading him now, going back, could say, if pieces of this are powerful, why not take this to avoid the sitting in your room listening to music and say, here is something that would give an opening for how we could be acting in the world in a way that sure would be with will, but not in a way that would be falling into all of the dangers he is describing. So yeah, I think it's a wonderful place where even in his own philosophy, there's an opening there that even if he doesn't take, we certainly could. And yeah, please follow up, yes.
Would you disagree then that art can be made political?
I'm sorry, I didn't get the...
That art can be done for a political purpose or something, or is it kind of enjoyment and personal fulfillment?
And the answer is, and I think you're absolutely right to ask the question, he would say no. So he wants to say art simply, the art that works, simply helps give us a sense of how to serenely see the larger world and therefore realize the absurdities of our acts of striving, which means by definition for him, it would not be political. But also, again, getting back to the key point of your questions, could we not reread him to say, well, but he's given us that opening even if he doesn't take it? So yeah, I think that's a wonderful, wonderful opening for a possible rereading of this entire philosophical development. Yes. Other questions or interventions at this point? Well then, if it's okay, should we turn to
Sure.
you and then
Sure.
we'll reopen things up again?
Sure.
Great.
So I'm going to make some remarks about Schopenhauer, specifically Schopenhauer, rather than Schopenhauer's relation to Buddhism or to the Upanishads. And let me begin by placing Schopenhauer in a comparative historical context regarding the history of philosophy. So first, let's relate him to a distinction made by the French philosopher Henri Bergson of the late 19th, early 20th century between the ethic of obligation and the ethic of aspiration. So obligation is the morality that tells us what our debts are, like the school philosophy, which we studied early in the course. And the ethic of aspiration is the one that shows us how we can ascend to a higher form of life. Now, Schopenhauer, like all the other figures that we'll study in this course, minus the school philosophy itself, is on the side of the ethic of aspiration, unquestionably. Now, a second contrast is with respect to the two families of ideas about happiness. Happiness as privation of suffering, therefore a negation, a negative state, and happiness as fullness of activity involving inevitably contradiction and therefore also suffering. So in that contrast, Schopenhauer, unlike most Western thinkers, is on the first side, the negative idea of happiness as a privation of suffering. Now, third, the conception of philosophy, philosophy itself. So we said early in the course that the classical conception of philosophy was a super science enlisted in the service of self-help. It stands above the specialized disciplines and professes to explain the framework of reality and the ground of being. And it offers, on this basis, self-help against the irreparable flaws in the human condition, beginning with mortality, groundlessness, and insatiability. Now, Schopenhauer is a very complete example of this conception of philosophy, rather than of the deflationary, the lesser conceptions of philosophy that appeared later in the history of the 20th century. And he professes to explain the ground of things, in fact, to explain what the framework is. In the preface to his masterwork, he says, "My philosophy is the definitive solution to the riddle of existence." Elsewhere, he also says that a man's philosophy is the expression of his temperament. These two statements cannot both be true, unless we think that there is one temperament, which is the rose by which reality is revealed. Now, a fourth, we can relate him to this contrast between the two dominant traditions in the history of world philosophy, which is the philosophy of deep structure, I call at one point the Greek philosophy of being, which comes already from Aristotle and informs even contemporary science, relativity and quantum mechanics. And on the other side, the philosophy of the timeless one, speculative monism. Schopenhauer is a rare and radical example within the history of Western philosophy of taking this second position, the philosophy of the timeless one. We would have to look very closely in the history of Western philosophy for such a clear-cut embrace of speculative monism. We see something of this in Spinoza and Leibniz, but it's not characteristic of the West. It was dominant in the philosophy of ancient India. And fifth, we can relate him to a contrast to approaches to the conduct of life. Use a vocabulary that I use in one of the writings that we assign, which is a distinction between three orientations to existence. So one orientation is the struggle with the world. And the central idea is that there is some narrative of transformation, of fateful action in historical time, although even continuing beyond historical time for the believer, which is the basis for our ascent to a higher form of life, a higher form of being. And we have two main versions of this in the West. We have the Semitic monotheisms, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, in which we think that our secular experience is enveloped within a larger framework of dramatic interactions between God and humanity. So that's one, and then we have The other secular view of this world revolutionary project of the last 300 years, with both a political and a personalist side, which also involves this idea that there's a dramatic conflict in historical time, resulting in the change of both society and the self, from which we can expect this ascent. The second approach is the approach of the overcoming of the world and of the will. We affirm the illusory or epiphenomenal character of the distinctions that are perceived in the world and of time itself, and we seek to rise through communion with the timeless one, the underlying reality. And this is a recessive strand within Western philosophy and religion. To some extent, it is present in the mystical countercurrents within the Semitic religions, within Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. But it is an anomaly, an exception in the West. And Schopenhauer very definitely belongs to this approach. He speaks for this approach as a minority voice within the West. And the third view is the humanization of the world, in which we say, we can't understand the framework. So if there's a metaphysic, it's an anti-metaphysical metaphysic, as we had in the original Confucianism, before the metaphysics of the Neo-Confucianism in the Sung Dynasty. But in an inhuman world, we can create human meanings. We can put our stamp and open a clearing in which our relations to one another will be informed by the sacrosanct logic of the interpersonal. Now, let's pause for a moment to consider the relation between this classification, the struggle with the world, the overcoming of the world, and the humanization of the world, and those two dominant traditions of world philosophy. Deep structure and the timeless one. The two classifications meet in the second one, the overcoming of the world and of the will. That coincides with the second major tradition of the world history of philosophy. The struggle with the world has no obvious philosophical counterpart. And neither does the humanization of the world. And I have argued early in the course, and will argue again, that they would fit more naturally with the position that I described as temporal naturalism. But in the West, there was an attempt to marry that idea of the struggle with the world in its religious form with the Greek philosophy of being, with Aristotle. Aristotle was taken as the instructor, as the philosophical guide of Thomas Aquinas, for example, the founder of Orthodoxy in the Catholic Church. And these three positions are on a kind of sliding scale. So the better the news, the harder it is to believe in it. So from the standpoint of an unbeliever, the first position, the struggle with the world, in its religious variant, is the one that delivers the best news. The unbeliever would say, it says, we have a friend in charge of the universe, and this friend has promised us eternal life. Now that's the best possible news, but it may be hard to believe it. Then we have the second position of the overcoming of the world and the will, in which the news is maybe less good, right? Because we say we can have salvation now, but it's not in our own bodies, in our embodied form, in historical time. We have to detach from that world. So that's not such good news for us. It may be easier to believe than the first thing. And the easiest to believe is the one that delivers the least good news, which is it's a meaningless world, but in this meaningless world we can create meaning. That's the third position, the humanization of the world. Now, let me say with respect to these fundamental positions that we're exploring in the course, that they are more than just the creations of particular thinkers. They are, once they have been constructed, revealed, discovered, permanent options. So that's why a position that was developed extensively in ancient India can then again be redeveloped or reinterpreted in the modern West. All of these fundamental options are options, as it were, forever in the history of humanity, permanent options of our thinking and of our orientation to existence. And this particular orientation that we are considering today and seeing expressed in Schopenhauer has permanent incitements. So what does it come from? So let me describe what seem to me to be the three main incitements to this view. The overcoming of the world and of the will, and the timeless one. So the first is the spectacle of the transience of everything. Everything around us ends. Everything turns into something else. That's the first incitement. The second incitement is the treadmill of desire. So we're on this machine. We're fastened to the structure in which there's desire, there's satiation, then there's boredom, and then there's more desire, and so on and on forever. And it's a torture, a permanent torture, which is experienced by the human being. That's the second incitement. And there's a third incitement to this view, which is the experience of consciousness and its seeming universality. So consciousness is often regarded as a mysterious thing. We certainly don't know how it relates to the physical, to the body, but it's claimed that we can't even define it. But I think it's very clear what consciousness is, even though we don't understand its sources. Consciousness is the awareness of being alive. And this experience of being alive, which is consciousness, appears to us as something which is not simply embodied in our individual bodies and has this universal character. And that's also an inspiration to this view. Now we come to three stages in which I want to speak briefly about Schopenhauer's philosophical ideas. First, his metaphysical position, his essential metaphysic, which you, Michael, have spoken to just now. Second, his view of the situation of the human being in the world. And third, the orientation to the conduct of life, the ethic that emerges from this position. So first, the metaphysic. A central idea in Schopenhauer's metaphysic, his metaphysical version of this position, which I say is a permanent option for humanity, is the observation that there is only one thing in the world that we can view both from the outside and from the inside, and that is ourselves. So from the outside, we're a body, an organism, and we can see it from the outside as part of the furniture of the world, like the other things around us. But we can also view it from the inside, and from the inside as what Schopenhauer calls will. So this blind force associated with the experience of being alive, and the central move in the construction of Schopenhauer's metaphysic is the generalization to the whole of the world, of our experience of this unique thing, the human self and the human body. So Schopenhauer's crucial move, never fully argued or defended in his philosophy, is the idea that we can view the whole world as we view the human self. That is, the same two-aspect theory, that this fundamental reality which we encounter in ourselves from the outside and from the inside, we can generalize to the whole of reality. We have a singular purchase on this reality, so let's take it then as the key to an understanding of the world as a whole. So the world has, viewed externally, and therefore through representations, through our ideas, is the world of time, of causality, of change. But the world also, ultimately, in its internal character, is this blind striving, this konados, this force, which we can't break down, which we can't separate into parts, and which is the intrinsic character of reality. That's the central tenet of Schopenhauer's philosophy. Now, I already said last week why this is such a perplexing position in metaphysics. So it's postulated, it's stated, it's not really argued for in any discriminate way, right? And it denies us any wedge of coming into reality, because if the world of time, change, and distinction is epiphenomenal, if it's not the inner nature of reality, how can we have access to the inner nature of reality? How can we make progress in discovering what it is if we can't think about its transformations? So, although Schopenhauer seems to be denying the Kantian thesis that the thing in itself is inaccessible to the mind, in a way, this problem reappears within his philosophy. And then we have the problem of how the world disguises itself in its appearance to us. Why? Why does it perversely describe itself in its reality? So these are the puzzles that emerge from this view. But the view itself is astonishing. And I want to read now two passages from the world as will and representation that seem to me to provide the essence of this view and a bridge between the view of the world and the view of humanity. Both of the passages come from the same chapter of part 2 of The World as Will and Representation, which is chapter 46 in part 2, on the vanity and suffering of life. So here's the first passage. This world is the battleground of tormented and agonized beings who continue to exist only by devouring the other. Therefore, every beast of prey is the living grave of thousands of others, and its self-maintenance is a chain of torturing deaths. However, an optimist tells me to open my eyes and look at the world and see how beautiful it is in the sunshine, with its mountains, valleys, rivers, plants, animals, and so on. But is the world then a peep show? These things are certainly beautiful to behold, but to be them is something quite different. So Schopenhauer says the world is wonderful to look at, but terrible to be. So now here's the second passage, which draws out the implications of this view. Awaken to life out of the night of unconsciousness. The will finds itself as an individual in an endless and boundless world, among innumerable individuals, all striving, suffering, and erring. And as if through a troubled dream, it hurries back to the old unconsciousness. Yet till then, its desires are unlimited, its claims inexhaustible, and every satisfied desire gives birth to a new one. No possible satisfaction in the world could suffice to still its craving, set a final goal to its demands, and fill the bottomless pit of its heart. So that's the view. That's the essential view of our situation in the world. And that then brings me to the second topic, which is our situation. So there's this striving, this konadis, this impulse blindly to seek being, and it enslaves us. And to this treadmill of satiation, boredom, new desire, endless, and so forth. And Schopenhauer remarks that it's most clearly revealed in the workings of the sexual drive. And this is decades before Darwin and before Freud, these astonishing statements, in which sex is seen as in the service of the reproduction of the world, this blind striving, and we're played with, right? And made to serve its purposes. So after one of these discussions of sex, Schopenhauer concludes his discussion with a characteristically merciless statement. He says, after copulation, we can hear the devil laugh. Well, that's Schopenhauer. And now I come to the ethical implications of this view. The approach to the conduct of life that emerges from it. So how are we to liberate ourselves from this treadmill of desire? And there are three main remedies, according to Schopenhauer. So the first is asceticism, the mortification of the will, the punishing of the will within ourselves. The second, higher one, is detachment. So, and we have an experience of detachment in art, trying to separate our observation of the world from desire. Had he not said that the world is wonderful to see but terrible to be, and so the attachment is to see it without being it. That's the solution. And he remarks that children are happy because they have a detached view of the world, revealing instantly how little he knew of children. And then the third remedy is holiness. And so Schopenhauer had developed his conception of holiness earlier in an essay that he wrote on the foundations of morality. And you, Michael, said just now that the ideal was implicit of sitting in his own room and so forth. But actually, he has another idea, which he doesn't emphasize, but it is certainly a consequence of his views. He says, we are really at one with everything else in the world. and therefore we have reason to serve them. So it is a universal altruism, which could also be described as a universal egoism, because we are this one thing. And he has this wonderful image of humanity as in a little boat in the midst of a storm on the ocean, hugging, with the people hugging each other. Remember the image of the porcupines in the cold night, separating, huddling together to warm themselves. Now there's the image of the rowboat. So there is an implication of altruistic service resulting from this idea. Although his main emphasis is not on the altruism, the main emphasis is on the communion with the one, but with the altruistic implication. So there you have what I think are three elements in a view of Schopenhauer. Now, the writers, the artists in the modern West have adored Schopenhauer. And I think they have this impression that Schopenhauer lifts the veil, and without sugarcoating, without anesthesia, he says it like it is. And he's a wonderful writer also. And so this is intoxicating. Notoriously, Thomas Mann wrote a book about him. Marcel Proust was fascinated with him. Beckett never traveled anywhere without having the world in representation in his luggage. And their view was that Schopenhauer's philosophy could be summarized by a remark made by one character to another in Beckett's play Endgame. You're on Earth. There's no cure for that. And so, but part of the reason why they so adore him is that they don't take his metaphysics seriously. So it's the phenomenological description of these experiences which is so attractive to them. So we're not in this position of the writers, and we can take these metaphysical doctrines seriously. So what should we think about all of this is the question. Here comes Schopenhauer. Schopenhauer says, in effect, I figured it all out. I understand what the framework of existence is. And he says that. He says that explicitly in his book. I figured it all out. And it's, of the three incurable flaws of the human condition that I described earlier, groundlessness, mortality, and insatiability, the one on which he focuses is the third, insatiability. So that's the problem he thinks that we can't solve. And he has a solution to it. That triple solution that I just described. Groundlessness, he denies. He says there is a ground. He knows what it is, and he describes it in detail. That's his philosophical system. And mortality, he relativizes. He relativizes because, as this whole position does, he relativizes by saying, it's not so bad that you're going to die, because you were never really alive in the sense in which you imagined, as an individuated being. And when he was asked, what's it going to be like after I die? He said, after you die, it's going to be just like it was before you were born. Another characteristic statement of Schopenhauer's. So mortality is relativized because mortality is an illusion. Groundlessness is denied, and insatiability is the real problem. Now, is this a pessimistic view? So Schopenhauer is supposedly the philosopher of pessimism. Now I'm going to tell you a very old joke that comes from the time of Leibniz. And it was a joke told at Leibniz's expense in the 17th century. So Leibniz famously is the philosopher who, in the popular versions of his doctrine, believed that this is the best of all possible worlds. And the joke is the following. Who is the optimist and who is the pessimist? So the optimist is the one who says, this is the best of all possible worlds. Well, that's Leibniz. And who then is the pessimist? He's the one who answers, you're right. And that's Schopenhauer. So I think that what that joke reveals is the essential equivalence between optimism and pessimism. Because they're both contemplative and ironic positions. They're the positions from the non-agent. The non-agent is a fatalist. And his view of the world can be described alternatively as optimist or pessimist. But there's the third one. The third one is the hopeful one. So the third one who is the one who is engaged in some project of transformation. The struggle with the world in its religious or secular form that I mentioned before. And for him, for the hopeful one, the question is, what can result from an attempt at transformation? The hope arising as the result of the attempt, of the struggle, rather than being an antecedent condition of the struggle. Well, that's us, and that's the whole subsequent world. So this revolutionary project of the last 300 years, this violent, sometimes crazed attempt to change the world and the self is all part of that. So that's what humanity has mainly moved on to, for better or for worse. And that's the main subject of our discussion in the subsequent weeks in the course. So there we leave him, Schopenhauer saying he figured it all out. The optimist and the pessimist arguing with each other. And then the hopeful one who appears on the scene and joins the argument. And they continue arguing. And their argument remains unsettled until their time runs out.
Let's open it up for conversation again. Please.
So I have a question about the role of the human here, because it seems like, in a way, he describes this kind of problem with the will as like a universal problem. It's a problem everywhere.
Yes.
But one question is, it seems kind of plausible that animals will suffer as us. They have these desires.
Yes.
Does he go even further? Does it become like a panpsychist or something? He believes like actually within every atom there's some kind of striving there as well. So that's like one question when he says like will is actually everywhere.
Yes.
And the second thing is like when it comes to these solutions, these ethical implications, they could potentially then solve problems or solve the problems for humans. But they don't seem to solve the problems for animals because they don't have this like awareness of like themselves in the same like way that we have. So is it like, would the ideal solution just be to end it all? That would be like the actual solution for, we can possibly escape, but the animals can't, or the atoms can't. So you see like, the solution seems
Well,
to be like
so let's separate this. So first of all, on the question of the nature of this fundamental entity, will, it's dangerous to identify the will with desire. So we can attribute desire to the animals. But clearly the will is a metaphysical force. It's this blind force in the world, this energy continuance in reproduction, which has no purpose, and which imposes on all who participate in it this terrible suffering. So this is the real object. Now, in the later history of philosophy, there were, take for example, Bergson. Bergson has in the partial philosophical exponents of the third position, the one that I call temporal naturalism, like Whitehead and Bergson. There characteristically appears on the scene an entity. For Bergson, it was the élan vital, the vital spirit, which is this blind force, and like it's the protagonist of a Bildungsroman. It becomes the character in the story. So that's the fantastical aspect of it, right? In which we're invoking this personage, this agent, and saying he's that, and it's not reasonable because Schopenhauer is claiming to understand the framework, and the framework involves the creation of this personage, right? The will, Bergson's élan vital, who is, as it were, the hero of this cosmic story. And that's obviously an overreach. That's this mysterious element in Schopenhauer's metaphysics, which seems impossible to justify. Now, the separate question is the question of who is participating in the suffering when we identify will with desire. So presumably the animals. But what's the sense of attributing this to inanimate objects? Then it becomes this animism for which there's no basis. So I think you can say traditionally Schopenhauer is described as the philosopher of pessimism, but cognitively, he's not pessimistic. After all, he claims to describe what the world is. And he says, this is it. And he establishes the framework. He announces the philosophy. He relativizes mortality. And then he focuses on insatiability. So there's a great deal of arbitrary shell game in this metaphysical construction.
Yes.
But it has immense power in its detailed evocation of an aspect of human experience. Yes. Yes.
So I'm just want to make sure I understand. Are you then going to be arguing next week that like Schopenhauer is one of the people that's like domesticated Christianity and died it down, where the
No, Schopenhauer is not a Christian to start with.
Okay.
And so Schopenhauer is not a Christian. He is his philosophical affinity is with this second major tradition in the world history of philosophy, the timeless one, and with respect to the approaches to the conduct of life, with the overcoming of the world and the will rather than the struggle with the world or the humanizing of the world. So it's remarkable because it's such an anomaly in the West.
Okay.
It's as if it were a voice from another world tradition of philosophy, the philosophy of ancient India, within the West. It's not the only voice. There are others, as I said, like Spinoza. But it is certainly an extraordinary exception. And what it shows to my mind is this fact that these are not just provincial events in the history of thought. This is the revelation of permanent options available to anyone, anywhere, anytime in the world. So actually, the arguments that we've been having are examples of this problem of the cognitive gap, right? That we can make arguments for and against these positions. We can make arguments. We've been making arguments. I made a bunch of arguments, but the arguments are obviously inconclusive. So, and this is, as I think, the fundamental theme in our course, right? We made this claim that this is the only question that we can't not answer. How will I live, right? So we have to, everyone will answer that question. If not explicitly, then implicitly by the way in which he lives. And we make these arguments. So these positions are, as I said, self-fulfilling prophecies, but they're not completely self-fulfilling. They're self-fulfilling in the sense they say, act as if I were true and you'll make the world more like the way I will say it is. But reality will fight back. And so they're not completely self-fulfilling. They may be self-destabilizing, for example, if we try to enact them. And so we can ask about these positions. Are they compatible with what we independently know about the world and about humanity, right? To the extent that they are self-fulfilling prophecies, will they in fact fulfill themselves? Or will they turn out to discredit themselves in practice? And so forth. So those are all arguments that we can make. But the arguments will not result in a settlement, right? So we won't be able to settle the dispute. And so one way in which we can progress in the dispute is by creating a new form of experience. So, and which is what these transformative projects try to do. They say, we'll change you, we'll change you, we'll change the world, we'll change society. And then we'll have a new body of experience on which to return to these issues. So Schopenhauer says the world is hopeless. We won't be able to change these realities that produce this treadmill of desire. But maybe we will be able to change it through these initiatives. And then our impression of these things will change. So that's the kind of situation that we're confronted with. Yes.
Is there any room in Schopenhauer for like distinguishing between, I guess what I see as like life being fundamentally meaningless, so this kind of treadmill of desire. So I have a desire, satisfy the desire, and have another desire, and what I would call like absolute suffering. So suffering for me seems to be something much more like hedonistic. It's like it's full, like my life is full of pain. That's horrible. So it could be someone like starving to death or being eaten by a lion or something. That seems to be fundamentally different from someone, a professor, writing a paper and wanting to become like to win a Nobel Prize in economics or something. That's it's like a treadmill of desire and they can't be satisfied, but it still happens on this kind of higher plane. And they're clearly like they suffer much less. While he seems to say it's all suffering. I'm like, no, this is much better than this other thing. So is there room for this in Schopenhauer, or is he missing?
Yes, but the basic picture is so early. So in the initial pages of this work, Schopenhauer says, at any given time in the world, thousands of animals are tearing each other apart alive just to live a little bit more. So that's absolute horror, but that, according to Schopenhauer, is what the world is like. And I suppose the idea is that these higher forms of suffering are fundamentally akin to the lower forms. They're much nicer to experience, but they're not fundamentally different. And
but it seems to be meaningfully different, and it seems to be more important to say if they're nicer to experience, maybe that's the fundamental thing rather than they look a bit similar, but they are experienced experiences with latter then?
So I think a fundamental question is the relation between hope and insight, right? So you gave this example, which seems an unexpected example in our conversation of the Nobel Prize. But it's actually an interesting example to think about because it relates to this issue of belittlement. I don't know, do we have a couple of minutes to deal with the Nobel Prize? So, you know, the Nobel Prize in economics is a fake prize, right? Let me say a word about this because it's a very interesting thing. So, the Nobel Prizes were established at the end of the 19th century, the beginning of the 20th century, under the will of Alfred Nobel, a Norwegian inventor who invented dynamite, became very rich, and established these prizes. In the 1960s, the Swedish central bank, nothing to do with Norway or with Nobel or anything, the Swedish central bank was involved in a conflict with the Social Democratic Party, which ruled Sweden forever until the closing decades of the 20th century. And very cleverly, they decided that in their struggle with the Social Democratic government, it was in their interest to enhance the prestige of economics. And what better way to enhance the prestige of economics than to establish a prize cynically called the Nobel Prize in Economics? So that's what they did. It's the Reichsbank Central Bank Prize in Economic Sciences, awarded in memory of Alfred Nobel. And the family of Alfred Nobel brought a lawsuit in Sweden to prevent the Swedish bank from doing this. But they lost the lawsuit because it's very hard to prohibit someone from pretending to pay homage to someone else who's dead. So they did this. And so every year they get these people who are doing the pseudoscience of economics, right? And from time to time they have someone who represents the loyal opposition, who is sort of the humanized version of the same thing. So that's the prize in economics. Now, this is a form of belittlement, right? And so, in which these people are having these chains of gold. They get up there, they wear this chain. It's part of this operation of servility, and so, and this is not a form of suffering like those other forms. But it should be if one has a higher view of oneself, if one has a higher degree of insight and of hope. And so this is connected. So I think Schopenhauer, if he were here and heard this conversation, I think would weigh in on my side. Yes.
Surely the substantive point of that criticism, like maybe you were unlucky to pick the example of the Nobel Prize in economics specifically, but like, doesn't the basic point hold that like there are better and worse lives? Like, can't we all?
Of course, they're better in life. So there's this element of luck, and this is another aspect of why the world is so terrible. Schopenhauer would say, right, that everyone suffers, but we suffer unequally, and the inequality in the way in which we suffer has nothing to do with our merits. It's this blind lottery. And now, I said, Schopenhauer does relativize mortality. So we might say, or he might say, it's terrible. But if you consulted all those people who are alive now and asked them, would you rather be alive or not? The vast majority would say they'd rather be alive. And in fact, you can say it's a terrible world, but each of us, by being alive, has won the cosmic lottery. So we have been snatched out of nothingness and brought into the world for this brief interlude. Is that not better than not having been brought in, right? But that's just the beginning. So, and the real question is what happens next? So that's the question of hope. Huh? And where's the limit of transformation? And to that question, this example of the Nobel Prize is very much relevant.
Wonderful. So thank you as always for a fantastic discussion. Next week we will turn to another attempt to rethink the Christian tradition, looking at Emerson and Nietzsche and the entire ethics of self-fashioning, which will, not surprisingly given the course, move us into yet another direction. Thank you so much. We look forward to seeing you next week. Wonderful.